Hello and welcome to the fourth session on literary theory. Our today's topic is structuralism. And our targeted audience is BS English first semester students. This program or this session is being conducted under the auspices of Himalayas colleges, under the expert and dedicated, guidance of Mr. Kashif Mahmood and Madam Azmat. Today's session is structuralism. It is in fact a sequel to the first session that we have already had. In the first session, maybe you remember, we focused our attention on entirely Saussure's theories or concepts concerning the nature of language. Structuralism, in fact, owes such a great deal to Saussure that people even go to the extent of saying that if all Western philosophy is a footnote to Plato's utterances, modern critical theory and a lot of work in the fields of sociology and anthropology, they owe a great deal to Saussure's work on language. In fact, they attach such a lot of importance to structuralism. Structuralism, which in fact, initially was a linguistic theory, but later on began to be applied in a variety of ways, in a variety of fields. If you remember, let us recapitulate things a little, helping ourselves get onto the track again. In this session, we've been talking about Saussure's concept of langue and parole. We know that Saussure was interested in the underlying system, which he called langue, and some even pronounce it as langue. He was interested in langue, the underlying system of language. The abstract system, the system which isn't visible, which cannot be seen or touched or smelled, the underlying system. Traditionally, linguists and those interested in philology, they have been taking interest in parole. Parole is actual utterances, actual performance, actual use of language. But Saussure drew our attention to the fact that the underlying system was more important. Performance, concrete utterance, spoken or written, important, but more important is the base, the underlying system. And he seems to imply, though he doesn't seem to explicitly put it in cours de linguistique, a course in linguistics, he seems to imply that without that underlying system, parole or performance or concrete utterances would have been an impossibility. It means at the very outset he lays emphasis on the underlying system. The second thing that Saussure seems to be extremely emphatic about is synchrony. Traditionally, earlier linguists, they focused on parole, the use of language in day-to-day speech, the use of language in our writings, performance, concrete use of language, parole, but Saussure seems to be interested in structures, as I have already maintained, that underlie all language. Structures that underlie all language. The theoretical system that shapes all language long. In fact, it is long that enables language to exist and function. All the speakers and those who have been studying linguistics a little, they know that later on Noam Chomsky, who incidentally still happens to be alive in America, and he has worked a great deal. But if you begin to ponder over Saussure's utterances, his work, his course, which was published posthumously after his death in 1916. Saussure died in 1913. But his colleagues and students collected his lectures and published those lectures in the form of a book. But in that book, his emphasis is on the underlying system. But where does that underlying system inhere? Or to put it simply, where does it reside? Where does it live? When we compare, him with Chomsky, the gentleman I was talking about, who gave us the concept of competence and performance. Chomsky seems to emphasize that language is based on a system of rules, and all the speakers of language happen to share that system. But the repository, the origin of that system is the ideal speaker hearer's mind. His contention has a psychological bias, that it resides in the mind of the speaker. But Saussure seems to be of the opinion that the system resides in society. Society, all the people in a speech community, they share a system, and that knowledge, the knowledge of that system, enables them to use language in day-to-day affairs of life. So, it should be clear to us now that he was interested in Saussure underlying systems. Underlying system that is there under individual examples. And then we come to know that in 1950s, Saussure's approach began to be applied to other disciplines. Claude Lévi-Strauss, an anthropologist, a French critic later on, Roland Barthes. These are the gentlemen who made use of Saussure's utterances or his contentions vis-a-vis the nature of language. But underlying structures cannot be easily identified. And if by underlying structures we mean the aggregate of the total, the sum total of all grammatical rules, no grammarian, incidentally, till to date, has been able to say with confidence that he has identified and come out with, penned down all the rules of grammar. What I'm trying to say is that identifying underlying structures is no easy deal. It means that you have got to use more than your intuition. And this use of intuition, use of thought faculty, to consciously or unconsciously perceive the structures that underlie language, culture, and society. It became central to all structuralist thought. Now, Saussure wasn't interested in referential function of language. We know that we use language to talk about things, to talk about people, to talk to people about them and about ourselves. We use language to express our emotions and desires and ambitions. We use language to narrate past events and predict future events. We use language to express our expectations. We use language to describe or define things. Reference function, referential significance of language. Saussure wasn't interested in this because his interest focused on the system itself, which in his opinion was self-sufficient. The system of language is self-sufficient. It's a complete, compact whole. It's complete. It's exhaustive, it's comprehensive system. It is there. And the system operates by its own internal rules. A word is but an arbitrary sign. And maybe you remember in our previous lecture we talked about words being signs. Words pointing to things, but they have no inherent organic connection with the things that we use words to point to. Words have no such connection. Words are used arbitrarily. A certain speech community, begins to call something a tree and it gets known as a tree. A certain speech community, at some stage in their evolution, began to call a chair and it began to be called a chair later on. So that knowledge is shared, and language, we all know, is a system of codes. It's a system of codes. And all the members of that speech community, they understand that code, and that is why communication is possible. But words are arbitrary. Words are arbitrary. They do not have any inherent or logical or essential or organic connection to the things that they seem to refer to. Yes, language becomes meaningful only because these words, which happen to be signifiers as well as signified. Maybe you remember in my last lecture, I was telling you that a word happens to be a sign, but it has a dual aspect. A word as a sign happens to be a signifier as well as signified. Now, Saussure was of the opinion that the word does not directly point to the thing that we are talking about. It brings a concept to our mind, and that concept is the signified. When we talk about, and this is incidentally what we talk about in our discussion of poetry, when we keep talking about the sort of images used by a poet. A poet uses, static images or mobile images or other interesting abstract images, static images like mountains and houses, mobile images like winds and flying birds and planes. Now, images, pictures that come to our mind, This is what we talk about in our discussion of poetry, that words invoke images, those images come to our mind. But a word remains an arbitrary sign defined by its different from other words. A bird is a bird because it isn't a tree. A bird is a bird because it doesn't happen to be a four-legged animal. It isn't a beast. A bird is a bird because it doesn't happen to be a chair. So, it is a positional relationship that gives words their meaning. This is one point that seems to have been attached a lot of importance to by structuralists and even Saussure. Because language is in fact, a system of relations between its constituent units. Even in our discussion of the structure of a sentence, we keep talking about, even in our junior classes, about a subject and a predicate. Moving a little further, we begin to talk about the fact that the subject is followed by the verb and the verb is followed by the noun. Moving still a little further, we talk about the fact that the nouns precede, adjectives precede nouns. Moving a little further, we talk about the fact that if we mean to talk about adverbs, adverbs will follow verbs. And if the verbs happen to be transitive verbs, requiring or sort of asking for objects first, then the adverb will come after the object. What does all this mean? It means that words happen to be in their syntagmatic relationship. Syntagmatic relationship. Words in their syntagmatic relationship. So, words do contract another type of relationship, and that relationship is paradigmatic. Maybe you remember in my last lecture, I gave you a sentence. I handed Zahid a book. I gave Zahid a book. I threw Zahid a book, etc. Gave, threw, handed. One word can substitute another, and this substitutional relationship is a paradigmatic relationship. So the whole business of language is the business of relationships. We need to keep in mind the fact that relationships are extremely important, and this is what will help us a great deal understanding structuralism later when we talk about the use or the application of structuralism or this theory in anthropology and sociology. So we are clear about syntagmatic relations, the relationships that language units have with each other in a sequence. And we talk about paradigmatic relations that a word has with other words that could be substituted for it. This sort of relationship is in fact a substitutional relationship, that one word could be substituted with another. So, signifier and signified. The first concept that we emphasized was long and parole. The second was signifier and signified. And the third that I mean to talk about today is, and we have already alluded to it briefly, is synchrony. If you look at the board, you notice there are two words written on the board: synchrony and diachrony. If we study history, the history of language or words, that would be studying language diachronically. And if we are interested in the way language happens to operate and exist today, that would be synchronic study of language. And interestingly, Saussure was more interested in synchronic study rather than diachronic study. And because he seems to be interested in synchronic study, to him a text could be spoken discourse or a written piece of text is a self-sufficient system. More important to Saussure. And then, in fact, previously the emphasis in literary discussions was more on the personality of the writer or the speaker, or the poet, or the novelist, or the playwright. How does the gentleman happens to reveal his personality in his work? But the emphasis in structuralist studies now gets shifted from the work to the text. The text becomes more important. The text functions as a self-sufficient system. A pure structuralist hopes to establish a grammar of texts. And this should remind you of Long and Parole. We've been talking about Long and Parole. Long is the underlying system, and Parole is the individual utterance, performance in speech or in writing. But structuralists, when they begin to apply Saussure's rules that he happened to enunciate vis-a-vis the nature of language, when they begin to apply these rules to sociology and anthropology and even history, even cuisine and study of rituals and myths, they do pay attention to the underlying structures, like the way we pay attention to the underlying structures in our study of language. So, pure structuralists hope to establish a grammar of the text or texts in general. They would say many things that would be true or applicable to all narrative work. We'll discuss it later on under narratology. Now, structuralists aim to be more scientific and inclusive. Normally, literary studies, it wasn't possible for people to be very precise and scientific and objective. And because linguistics, though still a controversy, is a science, and because it is a science, studying language in the manner of a scientist as if it were an objective reality, because we begin to study language in the manner of a scientist, and the conclusions that we make in our studies of language begin to be applied to anthropology and sociology, it means that we are trying to be like scientists, objective and unbiased in our findings and in our work. But the emphasis is on exploring the entire signifying system, the overall grand structure, as well as every word that happens to be a part of that whole becomes important. Now, if structuralism as a theory is that important and is now being used in anthropology and sociology and history and in the study of rituals and narratives, etc. Every book is now considered as a construct working by certain rules. A construct working by certain rules. It means that structuralism is characterized by a desire to stand back in a detached manner and study language or a literary work. As if somebody were writing from outside of a work, not involving himself. And this might remind some of the students of literature of T.S. Eliot's theory of impersonality, that a work is a construct. It's a construct, a complete work. Structural or structuralist criticisms, use of jargon, indicates that one is not for conventional, humane discourse, but writing from outside it. Having traveled thus far, structuralism has lost all vestiges of detachment. It has become actively involved in society, if only in a subversive role. We have begun to downplay the role played by society in human intercourse, exchange of ideas and information. So what began as a look at the structures of literature became an examination and rejection of the structures of belief. Rejection of the structures of belief and values that have been central in our culture. It means that a structural critic talks about general patterns in literary works or literary texts. And this seems to be an illuminating way of talking about literature. A structuralist critic plays down the idea of what a text can tell us about life. It makes structural criticism makes the book's own form its subject. The text or the book becomes its subject. It means that structuralist criticism is by and large reflexive. How the text might be discussing the gap between the word and the world. How the text might be discussing the gap between the word and the world. The gap between the structure of art and the structure of reality. It means that structuralism, in this way, when you begin to talk about the gap between the text and the reality, the word and the reality, it means that structuralism that began, in fact, its endeavors to be as detached as possible, now ends up accommodating conventional criticism by relocating the center of interest and claiming that writing is often concerned with the problems of writing about reality. Writing is often concerned about the problem of writing about reality. The emphasis in structuralism is on the limits of literature. That literature too has got its limits that it probably cannot possibly go beyond. How the world is more complex than the self-contained system of the text. The text has its own system, a self-contained system, as Saussure pointed out. But the world happens to be much more complex than the text, and the text seems in certain cases to lag behind. And this incidentally becomes one of its limitations. So structuralist critics would usually draw our attention to the way in which a literary text fails to order the world and fails to make sense of experience. Limitations. And this will what later on will land us into post-structuralism. Now, what are the limits of structuralism? A minute or two about the limits of structuralism. Critics concentrate on the text, but their interpretation is affected by their own sense of reality and their own values. The slogan is to attach utmost importance to the text. But is that possible? Could a critic, possibly negate his own personality while talking about a thing? Consciously, if not consciously, unconsciously, his personality would certainly come in. I remember in our literary discussions we talk about negative capability. The ability of the artist to keep his own personality as withdrawn, as aloof, as isolated from the work as possible. But even in such celebrated writers as Shakespeare and Milton, we notice that keeping their own self or keeping their own selves aloof is not always an easy thing to accomplish. Even in Shakespeare's plays, people do locate lines that exhibit autobiographical element. Even in an epic work by Milton, people do manage to trace occasions where the writer perhaps cannot 100% succeed in concealing his own identity. It means that critics concentrate on the text, but their interpretation is affected by their own sense of reality and their own values. We have got to make sense of the past, living in the present. It means our interpretation is bound to be determined by the 21st century frame of mind. Our interpretation is bound to be affected by the 21st century frame of mind. Structuralist critics focus on the text, rejecting interpretation in favor of description of the text's operations. How does the text operate? This seems to be their sole interest or worry. More interested in the text work being read in the light of ideas, of theories which are external to the text. Attention is drawn to the fact that all writing is concerned with ordering the world through language, and with the inadequacy of language to do so, including the language of structuralism. Language is, in fact, structuralist critics, they are trying to order the world, create order in a world that perhaps doesn't seem to have much of order in it. Regarding everything as a construct and order system, structuralism thus eventually turns on itself as yet another artificial ordering system. And that is the point at which structuralism becomes post-structuralism.